This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. I'm Dahlia Shenlin.
And I'm Gilad Halpern.
If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll to the bottom, click the big red button that says Patreon because we are counting on you. Every week, we bring you interviews with authors of books, research, and people who are studying fascinating topics. This episode is the first in a series sponsored by Tel Aviv University's Stephen Roth Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism and Racism.
Our guest today is Nancy Sinkoff. She is Associate Professor of Jewish Studies and History, as well as the Academic Director of the Alan and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. Her most recent book, From Left to Right, Lucy S. Dawidowitz, The New York Intellectuals and the Politics of Jewish History, has just been published by Wayne State University Press. Nancy Sinkoff is now joining us on the line from New York. Hi, Nancy. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So can you take us briefly through the life of Lucy Dawidowitz, the great Jewish American intellectual, and tell us what was it particularly about her story, that piqued your interest as a biographer?
Thank you. So the scheme of her life is that she's an American-born immigrant daughter. She was born in 1915 in the Bronx and is reared in what I would say is kind of a typical immigrant family, socialist-leaning, but a public school kid, and in a family that's hoping that her education will help her be socially mobile out of the Jewish working classes. And she's also educated in a Yiddish supplementary school. So that makes her very distinctive, and that's a very important part of the book. So she's educated both as an American and as a Yiddishist in the supplementary school system known as the Sholem Aleichem Folk Institute. And this changes her life because after she graduates from Hunter College, which was a single-sex women's college in the New York City
We know that. I know that because my grandmother was there around the same time, I might say.
Well, if your grandmother was left-leaning, because in those years she...
Was my grandmother left-leaning? Was my grandmother left-leaning?
Okay, so she joined the Young Communist League, and she was there from 1934 to 1936.
Maybe not that left-leaning.
Yeah. So, well, she abandons it quickly. That's a story. That's part of the story of the book. But the important part about her is that she is somewhat typical. You know, Hunter in Brooklyn College was 80% Jewish. And it's a little known story. People always pay attention to the male Jewish intellectuals who went to City College, but the school systems were separate sex. And that's, again, an important part of the book. But I want to emphasize that because she has a Yiddish background and is associated with Yiddish culture through the Sholem Aleichem Folk Institute, she makes a rather fateful decision to go to Vilna, Poland, in 1938 to be an aspiranteur, to be part of a cohort of kind of graduate fellows associated with the YIVO Institute, the Jewish Scientific Institute in Vilna, kind of secular university. And just think about a young Jewish woman sailing from New York in the summer of 1938 and arriving in Vilna, Poland, where she spends the year. And she leaves Poland shortly after the signing of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, comes back to New York, works in what is the American branch of the YIVO Institute with its director, Max Weinreich, who's also gotten out of Europe. And then she returns to Europe to work with DPs for 15 months in both the American and British zones of occupation in post-war Germany. So she is someone who is singed by the Holocaust. She's not a survivor, but she knew the world before the destruction of European Jewry. Most of the people whom she loved and knew were murdered, and this shapes her. And she comes back to New York in December of 1947. She marries a refugee shortly thereafter who had lost his first family in Warsaw. His daughter was actually a ghetto fighter who sprained her ankle and therefore couldn't leave with her comrades through the sewers. And Lucy then works for the American Jewish Committee for almost 20 years. And in her late 50s, she publishes her second book, but the book that begins to put her on the map of Jewish intellectual life. It's called The Golden Tradition, and it's an anthology of sources of East European Jewish life. And then from that book, she goes to teach at Stern College of Yeshiva University and quickly realizes that in order to teach about the destruction of the European Jews, she has to write a textbook. And she does. And that was the book that made her famous, The War Against the Jews, 1933 to 1945. And at that point, she is now a public intellectual. She has written for Commentary Magazine. She has thought long and hard about Jewish politics, culture, survival, Yiddish, Eastern European culture memory, and goes on to do other things. But in that trajectory of her life, she also moves politically from left to right. So what piqued my interest was all of the above. I'm a historian of the Jews of Eastern Europe. I'm interested in intellectual and cultural encounters with modernity. And Lucy S. Davidovich was a perfect vehicle for me to think about those issues and to think about the relationship of East European Jewish life to post-war American Jewish life. So that's what the book is.
Does she stand out in relation to other Jewish American intellectuals of her generation with respect to the issues that, the themes that you're so interested in?
Well, she stands out for several reasons. First of all, she's female. So if you think about the numerous, voluminous books that chart the trajectory of the Jewish intellectuals from their city college days to the emergence of neoconservatism, all of them are men. All the books on Irving Kristol and Norman Podhoretz and Daniel Bell and Nathan Glazer. And the outlier there is Irving Howe, and who remains a man of the left, and Alfred Kazin, who's a literary figure. But if you just think of so many of the books on American Jewish cultural life in the post-war years, very few women emerge. There are very few books. There's only one book on Hunter College, and it's actually a pretty good book, but it's routinely ignored because it's about women who became school teachers. And I don't need to tell you that doesn't make for great press, right? They married and they became school teachers. You have some extraordinary women at Hunter who do other things, but there's no work on them. There's no work on women intellectuals who are neoconservatives, except one biography of Jean Kirkpatrick. So in that regard, she is quite distinctive. She's female. She doesn't have a PhD. And also the narrative of the New York intellectuals is one about cosmopolitan Jews who are alienated from Jewish culture, who, if they return, quote unquote, to Jewish life, it's later. And she's very different. She never leaves. She is always involved with Jewish culture and life. She is always involved with Yiddish. She is always involved with the transnational connections of Jewish peoplehood. So she's got gravitas because she has the European experience that many of them don't have.
But I want to ask you about the point that you mentioned, that she is a woman in this group of very influential men. And I have to say that Gilad and I were discussing this before the interview. We were debating if she is less well-known, less influential, less renowned, or if it's just our impression, more forgotten in sort of general Jewish, I would say, the community self-awareness of their own more conservative leaders, thought leaders of that generation. Are we wrong to think that she is simply less well-known? And do you think it's because of her gender?
I would like you to clarify your question. Is she simply less well-known than
her male contemporaries? Because, first of all, is it true that, or is it just our impression? And secondly, is it because
I would say that because what made her, quote, famous or known were her works on the Holocaust, she is less well-known today because that field has exploded, right? So when she wrote The War Against the Jews, which is published in 1975, what other English language books did you have on what I like to call the Cholbun, right? The catastrophe, the destruction, in Hebrew, of course, the Shoah. You had Hilberg, very, very important book, but a book about perpetrator history, right? A book about the machine of death, created by the Germans. You had a few other works, but you don't have anything that uses Jewish sources or that talks about the Jewish response. In Yiddish you have this, but that's unknown to most Americans. So her work on the Holocaust, the war against the Jews, is really the book that puts her on the map. That's where she gets the reviews. That's where the New York intellectuals of the more cosmopolitan bent begin to pay attention to her. And in helping to create a field called Holocaust Studies, which she was ambivalent about, by the way, that has taken off. I mean, I don't need to tell you, the bookshelves, the college courses. I mean, it's the great cross-cultural hit, right? Is the Holocaust, unfortunately. And in that regard, her book is considered old-fashioned and behind the times. And she wasn't a PhD, and she didn't have access to archives the way we do now. So in that regard, she's not paid attention to. And what I was trying to do was put her back on the map as an intellectual, a public intellectual, regardless of how we appraise her Holocaust scholarship. Because at the moment, in the 70s, she was extremely important. And she was on the Holocaust Commission. She left it. She resigned, but she was invited to be on it when the museum and the memorial was debated in Washington. She wrote to everyone. Her archives are filled with letters from every major intellectual, Jewish and non. She wrote over 50 articles for commentary at the height of its influence. So I think she is absolutely less well known. If you mention Irving Kristol, Norman Podhoretz, who's still in the world, Irving Howe, Nathan Glazer, to political scientists, they will know those names.
And what about her what about some of her female contemporaries or slightly younger contemporaries? Cynthia Ozick, Ruth Weiss. I mean, also rather conservative Jewish, powerful Jewish literary intellectuals.
Yes, so they're very, very important. Ozick. First of all, let's think about Cynthia Ozick, Norma Rosen, Johanna Kaplan, I think Carol Kessner. There's a group. Laura Siegel was part of that group. Less well known, but also some of the figures you've just mentioned or I've just mentioned are writers. They are fiction and short story writers. So they kind of belong into it. They're not political thinkers. They don't engage politics. And
so maybe she comes closest to Ruth Weiss, except that I don't know if Ruth Weiss ever made any great transition. Seems like she started out fairly conservative.
Ruth adored her, so I will just tell you, I just got an email from Ruth this morning because she read the review in the Wall Street Journal, and Ruth adored Lucy Davidovich and felt like she was a speaker of truth, as did Cynthia Ozick. Very, very close. I have lots and lots of letters.
I think I need to disclose at this point that I studied with Ruth Weiss as an undergrad at McGill before she went to Harvard. So let's go on.
Yeah.
Lucky you.
Yeah.
Lucky you. Wait, I just want to say one thing about Ruth. Ruth, whether or not Ruth did not, I don't think Ruth was ever of the left.
Right.
And Lucy was, but they share a worldview. Absolutely. There's no doubt. But Ruth, again, let's be clear. Ruth uses literature to express her politics. Lucy loved literature, but she just addressed the politics head on. She's a different kind of thinker. She's an historian. Ruth is not.
Let's go back to Lucy. Considering her Yiddishist background and her stint in Europe on the eve of the war, which I'm assuming is pretty unusual for first-generation Americans of her Jewish Americans of her generation. Would it be fair to say that among her peers she was perhaps the most European? And if so, how did this Europeanness inform her work as a public intellectual, do you think?
I think, whether or not she's more or less distinctive than others, there were other people who go back to Europe. And they're European Jews who have come to the United States and then return. I'm thinking of Yaakov Gladstein, very famously. So there's a little bit more back and forth in the 30s than has been acknowledged. But yes, she is distinctive as an American who chooses to go to Europe. And I write the book that way. I write it in 4 parts. I write it it's a transnational, my book is a transnational intellectual cultural biography. And I kind of get upset in a way that it's going to be pigeonholed only as a biography or something, because it's really a book about the ideas of Europe and America in this post-war moment. She's absolutely more European. She is reared in an immigrant home with a kind of European ethos, but then she actually gets a European soul, if you will, by her year at the YIVO. And then when she comes back to New York and works at the New York YIVO, she's surrounded by European Jews, right? All the people working at the YIVO, most of them are European, including a great group that comes, refugees who come in 1940, including the man who will become her husband. So she's definitely more European. And then she goes back to Europe again and works with an international group of Jewish care or aid workers through the JDC. And these are people from South Africa, from England, from France, and from the United States. So this idea of a European sense of Jewish peoplehood is a very important part of her worldview. And that that both has shaped her, continues to shape her through the post-war years when she comes back to the United States, when many, many Jews are defining themselves as a religion and not as an international people.
And how did it play out in her ideas about the Jewish American condition in the post-war era?
Well, she's rather, I think, unsympathetic to the suburban, middle-class, acculturated Jewish way of life. It doesn't make sense to her. First of all, she's an urban person. She lives in Queens, New York, and then moves to Manhattan. So her identity is very tied up with sort of this spatial thing that we call a New York Jew. She's also not, quote unquote, religious, a word I'm not really fond of, but, she doesn't define Jews as a religion. On the other hand, she is drawn to traditional Jewish practice because traditional Jewish practice encompasses a sense of peoplehood. So that's the kind of religiosity that interests her, a Judaism that speaks to peoplehood.
Even though you say that her parents, or she says that her parents didn't actually teach her Jewish ritual at home.
Oh, it has nothing to do with her parents. No. Her parents, no.
It wasn't her household where she grew up.
Right. That was the immigrant household in which she grew up, where it was, I use the word Yiddishkeit, a word of great meaning, but impossible to translate. And I talk about that in the book as well, because she argues with Irving Howe about it. What does Yiddishkeit mean? It means this deeply embedded sense of Jewishness that's European, that encompasses, quote, religion, secular identity, culture, a sense of the past and a sense of the future. So that is who she is. And so American Jewish, again, suburban, middle class, upwardly mobile Jewish life doesn't make sense to her. On the other hand, she forgoes, what shall I say, this idea that somehow secular Yiddishism is going to sustain Jewish life, because she understands, as other intellectuals already did in the 30s, that secular Yiddish culture was a product of an encounter of traditional Jewish culture with the modern world, and that Yiddish could not be sustained. Already in the 30s, Yiddishists realized that Jews are going to acculturate linguistically, right? I mean, the kids who go to Yiddish schools in Poland in the 30s are also becoming Polonized. And the same thing with Yiddishists in New York. They're becoming Anglicized, right? She herself, English is the language, is her mother tongue in many ways. So Yiddish does not have sustenance in her view.
In some ways, I noticed that you talk about her shift from left to right, but it seems like she made a number of shifts. I mean, even early in life, for example, in those earlier years, you say that she was done with communism by 1938. Then she made the shift also essentially in the 30s, practically pre-war, if I remember correctly, from the Yiddishist humanism as the expression of modern Jewish identity, and then sort of began her longer journey as what you call sort of a patriotic Roosevelt Democrat to a more staunch conservative. I think that indicates something about a person when they are on long-term journeys of change. What do you attribute that to?
Well, I argue that it's, again, this bedrock of Yiddish culture in its broadest sense, that's kind of her wellspring or her anchor. She's not nostalgic about it. She doesn't think you can go back to that moment, all of those great intellectuals who encounter modernity. I mean, I started always in the 18th century. That's my first love. But, you think of the maskilim of the 18th century who were armed with all the traditional Jewish culture, but were intoxicated with Western culture. That moment gets iterated, I say, throughout Jewish modernity in Eastern Europe. But you can't go back to that. She knows that it's a historical moment, but it's still what roots her. So I think there must be like a plumb line or a leitmotif. That's her foundation. And that's what makes her shift politically and shift, quote unquote, religiously, because she wants to be in a space where Jewish group identity will always have a say. And that group identity has to be based on religion, culture, language, and history. She doesn't want any of those things to fall out. So she's going to insist upon that. But that's why she keeps moving, because it's not a static process.
It seems to me like her transition from left to right was not so much a binary leap, as often happens, but more, as you say, a natural progression. And some of the ideas that later matured, her right-wing ideas, were already there when she was, this a liberal, and vice versa. Also, after her transition, she still had some ideas that could be branded as leftist that she still espoused. And, it was just a natural progression where the right-wing ideas, at some point just, tipped the balance and prevailed. Is that a fair description?
Oh, and I have to pile on, because Gilad and I love piling on. Somewhere in there, I would be curious to know, do you think she was ever a liberal? Sounds like she started out more active in communist circles and ideology and then moved towards a more conservative approach. But I'd be curious to hear your characterization of exactly the process Gilad is talking about. Which ideologies did she go through?
So I want to just first address this issue of evolution versus binary. I think that's the challenge of anyone who's writing a life history, right? This is sort of the challenge of history in general. One sees things, and is it evolutionary or not? And it's a little sometimes difficult to answer. I do think she felt that she was involved with a natural progression. And by the way, the other neocons do too. I mean, Irving Kristol says that all the time. He said, I didn't change, the world changed, right? Liberalism changed. Liberalism became anti-liberal in many ways, they would argue. And they think they're holding the flag, that they're still flying the flag for liberalism or for civicness. I think that's an important part here, civicness, that stability, the rule of law, reasoned argument, all of those things characterize what they think liberalism is. And by the late 60s, the liberals are no longer liberal. They are dogmatic. They are too left-wing. They do not allow Jewish groupness into the debate. They become anti-Israel. They champion causes and violence. So I think that is, so for her, it's a natural evolution, but she feels like her value system hasn't changed. I want to just make sure, the communism, it's not that I don't take it seriously that someone was a communist, but I think it was she was a college student, and, let's all forgive our foolishness. I think that I don't think it was decisive. I don't think it was decisive, except if we can say that the children of the 30s have a kind of temperamental a sort of kind of rejectionism. I mean, she's, has an unforgiving side as a person. She draws lines. There's a partisan quality to her thinking. Mm-hmm. And perhaps that was why she was attracted to the communists, because they were, they meddled in that. Right. Mm-hmm. If you're a socialist, you're a reactionary. Right. I don't need to, the communists spend their time in the 1930s going after their fellow leftists almost before they start fighting the fascists. So, but she leaves that. She is a liberal. So that's, Dahlia, I want to go back to you what you said. Okay. Yes, she is. She's very much a liberal. She's a Roosevelt liberal. For her to pull the lever for Reagan at that point she was happy to, but it wasn't natural. That wasn't who she had been. She was involved in the American Jewish Committee, where people were liberals, really fighting hard, believing that American liberalism was the safest place for Jews. But she was also influenced when she was at the committee for those 2 decades by people who had strong Jewish identities and were unapologetic about that. Milton Himmelfarb is very important to her. Nate Perlmutter, who was at the ADL in those years, extremely important to her. And these were men who were unapologetic about the value of being Jewish. And just to go back, in fact, to the 30s, Zelig Kalmanovich, who is one of her mentors at the YIVO, is someone who had been on the left and who came to the conclusion that you could not harness the Jewish future to one political ideology, that was an error, that the important fight to fight was for Jewish cultural autonomy. And wherever you landed politically, that was okay, if you will. And that was Kalmanovich's influence on her. Very, very important.
Well, that's what I wanted. I mean, sort of the next logical question for me is this part where I'm just going to quote you for a minute. You say she rejected the enshrinement of liberalism as an essential characteristic of being Jewish much earlier than the New York intellectuals. And it seems to me that what she's saying is, this is not an expression of Jewish values. Political ideology should be chosen as it serves the safety of the Jews, or as it serves Jewish interests where they happen to live, which sounds a little bit, I don't know, it sounds a little bit utilitarian. I mean, are there any absolute political values that she would support herself or that she thinks are an expression of an authentic Jewish culture?
Well, I think what happens with the neocons is to some degree, they begin to say things like that, that neoconservatism is actually an expression of Jewish values. I don't think she actually, we talked about one of her, friends who might say that today, Ruth Weiss, but I don't think Lucy Davidovich would say that. She called herself an independent neoconservative. She felt towards the end of her life that the Republican Party and the values of her friends who were neoconservatives would protect Jews more than the radicalization of the liberal camp. But I think at the end of the day, what she cares about is Jewishness. That's what she really, really cares about. She's not exactly a political thinker. When she gave the State of World Jewry address in 1984 at the 92nd Street Y in New York, where she charged American Jews to vote for the Republican Party, there was a lot of pushback to the talk. And there was really a sense that she was a teeny bit out of her league politically. She hadn't thought through all the political implications of what it meant to support Reagan, from tax cuts to, Iran-Contra. Those things weren't what she was thinking about. She was thinking about Jewishness and civic society and a kind of discourse in America that would allow for Jewish distinctiveness. That's what motivated her.
To what extent do you think that these ideas and her support for Reagan and other expressions thereof were informed by her Holocaust scholarship?
Well, I think what I would say is that her life experience informed her Holocaust scholarship. So when you read her memoir, From That Place and Time, she talks about the street violence against Jews in Vilna. And this really shocked her, not so much that there was, street violence, but that it had infected the university. And I think that's a very important moment for her, to realize that the university, which is supposed to be a bastion of civic identity and civic safety and civic values and toleration, that in fact, the university can be infected by this poison called anti-Semitism. And by the way, Max Weinreich, and this is very important as well, Max Weinreich's first book is called Hitler's Professors, which is about the complicity of the German intellectual class in fostering anti-Semitism. So here you have a young woman who has gone to Hunter College, which was a great school, is well educated, loves English literature, believes in all the things that universities are supposed to do in terms of toleration. And she experiences directly the anti-Semitism of students. Max Weinreich was blinded by a student riot. Chaim Grada walks with her through the streets of Vilna and says, we have to go into this alleyway to protect ourselves. And then, the Holocaust occurs and has been bolstered by intellectuals. So she is jaundiced about whether or not universities will protect liberal values. And that informs the way she writes about the Holocaust and the way she writes about ideas, and informs her own, again, sense of liberalism's fecklessness.
And I think that it sounds to me that you kind of, in order to make this bridge between her thinking immediately following the war and her understanding of the Holocaust, and then her later, support for conservative politics in the 80s, we have to go through the road seems to run through the 1960s. And it sounds like that she interpreted, in general, the radical upheavals of the 1960s, in particular, the Black liberation movements, in light of her interpretation of the Holocaust and specifically the Jewish experience. Can you talk about that for us?
I think that's absolutely true. And that circles back to Gilad's question about her Europeanness. I think she both reads correctly and incorrectly what's going on in the 60s, not only the 60s in general, not the let's talk about the counterculture doesn't suit her aesthetically. I think it's very important just to get to the crux of the matter. When you look at the yearbooks of immigrant kids going to Hunter and City College, they're all wearing suits and ties, right? I mean, it's there's a sort of decorum and a propriety of that encounter. And the 60s just blows that out of the water on that. I'm not telling you anything anyone doesn't know.
But I want to focus. I mean, it's more than that.
No. Yeah. So I think but that's not unimportant. The aesthetics of the counterculture, the utopianism, the use of drugs, the libertineness, all do not comport with her her feeling about how it is to be an American. Let's start with that. It's not unimportant. The aesthetics are not unimportant. And then there's the misreading, if you will, or the fear of the radicalization of the civil rights movement. She's someone, again, due to her work with the American Jewish Committee, who was very much in favor of civil rights until 1964, felt very moved by the nonviolent protests. I mean, who wouldn't be? Knew people, the American Jewish Committee was very involved with people like Bayard Rustin and other moderate, quote unquote, moderate leaders of the civil rights movement. The problem is both the performance and the actual violence as civil rights and the anti-war movement as they radicalize. The problem is violence, the kind of apotheosization of it. Nathan Glazer talks about it too. If you look at Commentary Magazine from the late 60s, there are many, many articles about what the violence is doing to civic society. And for Lucy Davidovich, violence and instability in a society will redound negatively to Jews. And she analogized the radicalization of the Black movement as a kind of American pogrom, as an American pogrom. That's the best way to put it.
I'm curious to hear about your misreading. As it happens, I happen to be reading right now Malcolm X's final speeches, just because I am. And he talks a lot about, the anti-Semitism as a natural outgrowth of white dominance. I mean, he's critical of it. He speaks of Jews as part of the struggle in a way. I wouldn't say it's a central part of his speeches, but it's hard to detect the kind of fear that she is talking about, which sort of turns the Black liberation movement, at least in my reading of your rendition, as something that might lead invariably towards this. And so I guess my question is, was she right and was she wrong? You said that in some ways maybe she misinterpreted things. And was that an inevitable interpretation of somebody who was as deeply touched and, had experienced the before and after of the Holocaust in Europe?
Okay, so first about Malcolm X. I mean, I think if you're reading the late Malcolm, Malcolm X talked about someone who went from one position to another. I mean, he's such an important and such a complicated figure, and his early works are The White Devil, and then by the end, he's got a different approach. So, I mean, Malcolm is, again, it depends on what you can find a lot of different things in him.
So it seems like you might need to write your next book about him.
Well, actually, I've got to go back to Europe for my next book. But anyway, that's a different story. But I don't think that inevitable, you're talking to an historian. Inevitable is not a word we like to use. And for every Lucy Davidovich, a good place to look for the complexities is in the collection called Negro and Jew. That was a book published after I'm going to say Midstream. I just want to get that right. Midstream, Shalom Katz's journal, published did a symposium in 1967 on these issues, and Shlomo Katz asked a lot of different people to write in. And for every Lucy Davidovich who's afraid of militant Black civil rights activism, there's someone else who says, don't mistake it. They're not pogromchiks. They're fighting against white society. It's the role of Jews to support the civil rights movement, even if it becomes more assertive. So there's nothing inevitable about her position. I think that what I tried to show is her position emerges out of, again, the Holocaust experience, going back to Gilad, knowing what was lost, the fear of violence, the distrust of liberal institutions to protect Jews. I think that's it's not inevitable for her, but I historicize it. That's where I think she comes out of. When I say a misreading, and I think this actually speaks to the moment, my moment, if you will, which is that Jews become coded as white. They don't feel white, but they are coded as white. And that means they are, not all Jews, but many American Jews don't fully understand the experience of being a Black American in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, until today, the systemic racist past. It's not easy to face it as an American. And I think that she, because of her own vulnerabilities, because of her fears, because of the trauma of fleeing Europe, I think what that was like for her. She gets on in a turnaround day's notice. She leaves Vilna, takes a train to Warsaw, takes a train to Berlin, takes a train to Copenhagen, and waits for a ship to take her back to the United States. And the war is now raging. I mean, that couldn't but affect her. So in that regard, that she never really could purge that. Why would one be able to? And that informs the way she looks at her own society as it's beginning to crumble. I mean, think about the 1960s, the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Robert Kennedy. I mean, Kent State. I mean, well, that's in the 70s. I mean, the society is erupting around her.
And now towards the end of this conversation, because we are running out of time, the million shekel question. What did she have to say about Israel? It seems to me that not much compared to other issues that preoccupied her.
The million shekel question. Was there a TV show called that?
No.
I always say to my students, the $64,000 question. They don't know what I'm talking about. No. Israel is Israel's very important to her in a emotional way. She's not exactly a Zionist, but she is very hostile to anti-Zionism. And I have great letters and great exchanges between her and Irving Howe debating the role of American Jewish intellectuals vis-a-vis dissent on Israeli policies. And she says very clearly to Irving Howe in the middle of the first Lebanon war, it is not right of American Jews to criticize Israel when it's in the fighting for its survival. Israel represents to her, I'm quoting, the embodiment of Jewish civilization. She's not interested in Israel politically. She is interested in Israel as the refuge of Jewish peoplehood. And as long as Jews live in Israel, American Jews need to support Israel. That's where it stands for her. She visited Israel several times. She had a beloved best friend, Dr. Pearl Ketcher, who she met when she was working in the British zone of occupied Germany. Pearl immigrated to Israel, had a very important role there in the Israeli medical establishment. She's a physician. Her brother is a journalist. Her other brother starts the Israeli press corps. And this was Lucy's home away from home. But and she knew other refugees from Europe, Chona Shmerok. I mean, I could go on and on. Israel's very important to her, but it's not the politics of Israel. It's Israel as the continuity with the glory of Ashkenazic civilization that had been, so brutally and mercilessly destroyed in Europe. So Israel is very, very important to her. But again, in that way, as a kind of ethos or civilizational continuum, not the politics of Israel.
I also would like to quote something that you wrote in the book, that her life helps us connect post-war American Jewish political conservatism to the long history of Jewish politics, end quote. Can you explain exactly what that means?
I really thank you for that, because I think that's so much when you think about why you write a book. It was very important for me, it is important for me to, as an historian of the Jews, to allow Jewish history and Jewish voices to speak however they speak. And here I would invoke Gershom Scholem. He said famously, something like Kabbalah is nonsense, but the study of it is Wissenschaft, right? So what I mean by that is I do not think that there's one way that Jews express themselves politically. And there's a kind of frustration that I have as an intellectual of the history of the Jews when I hear people assert that that's not a Jewish way to be politically, or Jews must support this particular party, or Jews have always been liberals, or, they quote from Deuteronomy and they say, this is Jewish politics. You want to quote, taking care of the stranger. I believe in taking care of the stranger. Don't get me wrong. But, have you read the book of Joshua? Read Judges? I mean, for every liberal sentiment in Hebrew canon, you're going to find an illiberal Hebrew sentiment, illiberal sentiment. I'm sorry, I'm getting garbled here. So that is what was important for me, is that the post-war American Jewish experience of liberalism is not the only way that Jews can express themselves politically, and that her conservatism was not Jewish. She was dipping into a longer history, a deeper reservoir. And until the modern period, again, late 18th, early 19th century, Jews were not politically liberal. There wasn't liberalism. But if you don't know the Jewish past in its long, as we historians call it, la longue durée, you won't know that. If you start thinking about Jewish politics from the French Revolution forward, you won't understand Jewish political history.
Okay, hopefully with a more richer understanding of Jewish history, American Jewish history in particular. Nancy Sinkoff, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you both.
And thank you to Itai Shelem and to Georgia Foscarini, our sound engineer and producer, and again to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. And thank you in particular to the Roth Institute for sponsoring this special series. Now, a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcast app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Just go to the ratings and review section and write us the best you've got, whether it's good, bad, or ugly. But we like all kinds. You can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Check out the archive with over 500 interviews. If you like us, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. Follow me and Gilad on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.